This week on the show, we're really proud to be able to, and kind of humble, point a bit of a spotlight at Sony Pictures Animation, who are celebrating 10 years of producing some of the world's funniest and most entertaining animated feature films, and Sony Pictures Imageworks for 20 years in the visual effects industry, marking an amazing body of work, both creatively and technically. And I got to sit down with a number of the guys at Sony in LA, starting with Ken Ralston, 5-time Academy Award winner. So you left ILM and you'd just done some incredibly successful and creatively successful films. Was it a new paradigm? Did you feel?
It ended up being that. I think I said something like when I first met everyone here at the time that I came down here to do things my way, not what's been done. And so I did as much of that as I could. And how many years ago was that? I don't even know. But came down and just kind of walked into this place, and we were at the lot at the time in the old TriStar building, and just started to try to make sense out of this thing. I mean, I didn't come down to do what they were doing. I just came down to try and create a world-class visual effects facility. I mean, why else would you want me here? And so that was the job.
So you had to pull a good team around you, but in addition to that team, and I know that must have been first and foremost in your mind, what did you think that was sort of the central thing you had to get a handle on here? What was it that made your sort of list of things you needed to address?
Oh my God, it was a big list. I mean, I hate to say it. Really, it was a tough thing because walking into a whole new place that was running in some form, one thing I did is I took on a little movie called Phenomenon, which I could get in here. It was a very small movie. I just wanted to see how that little movie went through the facility.
Right.
Well, it didn't go through smoothly. And the simplest work was a little on the difficult side. So that started like the radar to go up and go, okay, where are weaknesses here? And you know, individuals, I mean, who else do we need here? What departments do we need to beef up? It was quite a large undertaking, so I can't really pick one or two things. It was really about trying to configure the facility and get the right people in, mainly the artists, that could do the work they eventually wanted to do. And it was really a juggling act over the years about taking a small couple of jobs, doing this little bit of work, then taking a job that was harder than we probably could do, and then do that. And then another one, because it's initiation by fire. You're either going to succeed, and it will, as painful as it can be, pull you into the next level you want to be, or it'll take you out completely and we shouldn't be doing it anyway.
Was there a moment where you said, okay, well now we're starting to get somewhere because now this is work that I'm feeling much more confident that, you know?
I think Contact.
Because I love that film.
It was probably one of the most painful films I've ever been on. But it was a huge, dangerous gamble for this place to do that movie. I mean, really, at the time. But I knew everyone had it in their blood to do it. And it would just be bigger than they had expected. Plus, at the same time, Starship Troopers was sort of in the mix, too. Both very difficult movies. And but Contact, it meant a lot to me, too. It was for Bob Zemeckis. I'd done all these movies with him. I didn't want to fail on this one. And I figured, well, it's now or never. The movie showed up. I'm here. Let's just do this.
I mean, I got here in '96 when so many people were converging here at Imageworks. I know Ken Ralston, Debbie Denice, and a lot of group from ILM came here, and you know Jerome Chen had been here already. But I left Rhythm and Hues and got here in '96, and it was we were doing Starship Troopers and Contact, and all these things were happening, and multiple talented people with different ideas of how pipelines should work and the way work would be done happened all at the same time. And so, you know, vivid memories to me still were how groups of us would go off and form a process, how to get a particular sequence done, or how to deal with shading, or how to deal with compositing, how to deal with color space. And so a lot of things were really kind of jumbled up, honestly, in the beginning. Now, there were established processes here before we got here, but when you start doing huge pictures, you know, film resolution, scanning, all of these things, it started to kind of just change things for us. And so, for instance, the way things I did at Rhythm and Hues might be different than the way Steven Rosenbaum wanted things to be done, or the way Jerome Chen wanted things to be done. So in the beginning, it felt kind of scattered, honestly, like everything was in a blender, and it was like, just get shots done, just get the sequences, whatever it takes, get them done. And we did get them done. But I can almost trace lines back to some of those days in the 90s when it was, we're still kind of doing that, or that's a root that has grown into this tree.
Well, see, I think one of the great advantages of Sony is that it does have a corporate memory, because you know, it's very clear that you're developing techniques that not only are moving through the company, but actually with the open source initiatives the company have actually sort of gone out and spread into the community.
Right.
And of course other artists will leave and go elsewhere and take ideas. But can you maybe discuss a couple of those early things from the 90s that were in that blender?
Yeah, the one that comes to mind, I think mostly because I was very present in that process, was Houdini. Now, when I got here to work on Contact, that was actually the first movie I did with Ken Ralston. And ironically, here we are like 16 years later, and we both just did another film together, Men in Black 3. But back then, I was tasked with doing the opening shot on the movie Contact.
Which at its time was like the longest single shot kind of in...
Yeah, it turned out that
history.
way. It was originally boarded to be like this 30-second thing, right? But nobody's really working on it except some people in the art department. And so I'm kind of an astronomy buff, and I love stars and whatnot. So I started kind of just playing with a little bit of visualization at night. And we were using Houdini at the time, a beta version of Houdini, actually, as a pre-release version, and to do some particle simulations for some effects of the wormholes effects and stuff. So I started playing with things at night, and I told Steven Rosenbaum and Ken Ralston, I said, can I just play with this a little bit? And for me, that was previs. We used Houdini to actually slowly build that shot into the almost 4-minute piece that it was. And to this very day, we're using Houdini as a solid core piece of our effects pipeline.
Yeah. And so, obviously, the same thing would have happened with some of the bigger animated sort of projects you worked on?
Right. Well, the next thing that was kind of floating around was Stuart Little. And that was significant to the company and for all of us really working on it, because it was, for us, it was one of the first times that the lead character in a film was animated. And, you know, it wasn't a plastic ball, it wasn't a blob, it wasn't some surreal kind of creature. It was a walking, talking, clothing-wearing furred mouse that had to interact with human beings. And we assembled a small team from some people from Contact and some people from Starship Troopers as well, and started figuring out, how are we going to do fur? How are we going to do clothing? The facility had never really taken on anything that big before. We didn't know how many shots it was going to be, but we knew it would be in the hundreds. And this character would have to withstand close-ups, wide angles, sometimes in the same shot, and multiple costume changes. We were told that there's a moment in the script where the mouse would get wet. And that just kind of blew our minds. Like, wow, we've got to do wet fur now, you know? And ILM had been doing some work on fur, and of course we've been seeing other companies doing it, but it was a huge, huge challenge for ImageWorks at the time. And lighting tools, so much came out of that film for the studio.
It's funny you mentioned lighting tools. One of the things I remember from a talk back then on the film was there's a great scene where Stuart's sitting between his two adopted parents, and somebody made the point in the lecture, and I apologise if it was you that was giving the lecture, but I was so enthralled by this point, which is that you'd gone to a lot of trouble to mathematically get the lighting right at that point on the duvet or the duna between the two characters. And of course the character didn't look lit, because if that was a hero actor, real life, you would light them with proper movie lighting and give them their due. And so letting them just only have the light that the actual actors were being lit with sort of didn't work. And it was this beautiful point, I think, where you sort of go, well, okay, we can do this mathematically and we can do this artistically, and we have to balance those two things.
That's exactly right. And it's something, that was a really big lesson for me. I mean, you know, I'm an artist, and I grew up and, you know, studying painting and drawing and sculpting and whatnot. But to get into having to recreate or create from scratch something that didn't exist, and to realize, like, okay, reality is not necessarily very interesting, right? It's not. So using reality is just a baseline. then you want to cross over into the artistic side of things. You want to art direct everything. So ultimately, you end up wanting to control all of it. But to your point, that really had all of us kind of grow into another level of thinking differently, thinking like a photographer, thinking like a cinematographer, and throwing away the math. And not worrying about what reality is, but what makes the glint in an eye bring out an emotion. It can change by putting the highlight underneath an eye.
Yeah.
Top left, top right, because sometimes you might go against exactly what's on the set. You might do it on your own, and that evokes a different emotion than what may have been shot in the scene.
Well, I came in at the end, the very end of Contact, in the very beginning of Stuart Little, the first Stuart Little film. And that was a really interesting time because the studio had just gone from being able to do one movie at the same time to being able to do two. And they did Contact and Starship Troopers at the same time.
Which is a big films.
Huge films, especially for the era that, at that time. And that's a huge transformation for the studio. I came in on the tail of that transformation, and at that point we were taking a chance on making the first CG character to star in a movie. Like, that just hadn't been done.
Yeah.
So, of course, Ken Ralston had done Roger Rabbit before then, but that was, of course, 2D animation. To try to do that in CG before anyone had really done a furred character that held up for more than a handful of shots.
Well, also, Stuart had to have, it wasn't just a digital character for me, he had to have an emotional sort of context that a monster didn't have to have. And we could have a digital character, but it could be two-dimensional and still work in the plot.
That's right.
But I had to actually care about this guy emotionally, which, I did. I mean, it was a great achievement.
None of us knew whether that was going to work or not. I mean, we did the screen test, this one shot, and everyone went, wow, that actually holds up pretty well. I think we can pull this off. But like, we didn't know at the time that cloth sim was going to take an army of artists. We assumed that it was going to be a cloth simulation, that once we got the parameters set right, we would just run it as a procedural part of the pipeline before things got to lighting. Like, we just really had no way of knowing, and we got into that part of the process, and we're like, well, the simulation runs, but it's not the look we want in every shot. And so all of a sudden we were assembling a team of cloth artists to adjust tailoring on shots, or take multiple sims and blend them together and write tools to filter out noise.
Well, if you only had cloth, you'd have been going pretty well. You had fur as well.
And the interaction between the two, which of course, it was maybe irresponsibly ambitious, but it actually worked. I mean, the funny thing was, as we were putting the movie together sequence at a time, of course we started out with all these empty plates and actors, and everything had been shot with a lot of planning in mind, but the scenes, it was just a voice and an empty plate, and it was like, is this movie going to work or not? And as we got the mouse into more and more shots, it became clear that the movie itself was actually going to work, and our character was holding the role in the movie that we needed him to hold, and in addition to all the technical accomplishments.
Didn't Stuart get wet as well?
Yes, he did. He ended up in the washing machine. That was actually one of my big sequences, was a washing machine sequence. I was doing effects animation with a couple of really amazing compositors.
So that would be fur, cloth, and water sims.
Yes.
And what was the year? This was like going back...
94, maybe?
Okay, so what were you thinking?
It was crazy. It was so ambitious. But I mean, we had an amazing group of people on the show. You look back at the cast of the people that worked on Stuart Little. John Dykstra was visual effects supervisor. Jerome Chen was DFX or VFX supervisor with him. All the CG supervisors are people who've gone on to incredible success. Jay Red, Scott Stockdike, Jim Burney. Those were the CG supervisors on Stuart Little. I was in the effects animation department, getting to do everything from cloth deformations to bubbles to water to just a wide variety of things. And it was just a great crew of people who, we really wanted to put our mark on how you can make a movie this way.
And you worked also on Stuart Little 2, didn't
Yes.
you? Which had its own set of problems as well, or rather, I should say, creatively, challenging technical things.
Right. Yeah, so it gave us an opportunity to kind of not reinvent the wheel, but rework a lot of the tools that we had. We developed a bunch of new grooming tools for the fur, rewrote the way we did cloth and simulations, and completely revamped the way we shaded that cloth. We had to develop woven sweaters and yarn, and it was a totally different level than just painting and using displacements. We were actually using a lot of new techniques in RenderMan to achieve those results. And then the biggest challenge of that movie was a feathered peregrine falcon.
There was very little we took on in Stuart 2 that we knew for sure we could do. The falcon with all of its feathers and all the patterning was really, really ambitious. There was a CG building, which at the time, I mean, this was the era that well, both Industrial Light and Magic and us started using ambient occlusion for the first time because we're doing these large flat surfaces and you render them in the computer, and without any more sophisticated shading, they look like, you know, maybe decent looking plastic.
Yep.
And we're all trying to figure out, like, what can we do with the computing power we had available to us, which, you know, I think the computers might have had 256 megs of memory at the time.
But there was no subsurface scattering.
No subsurface.
Getting that realism.
Well, you know, we had a fake subsurface. We had a backlighting technique for the back of Stewart's ears and the beaks. It wasn't subsurface, but what it was is you could put an extra light behind his ears and we would glow it red through the ears so it felt like something that was a little more alive.
Okay.
But it was far from the subsurface that we know and love today.
And you certainly didn't have any of the kind of fluid sim sophistication that you'd have, you know, off a film even a few years later. Like
That's
a couple
right.
years later, yeah.
It's interesting, the ripple system that we use, so there's a shot in the washing machine and all the water is going back and forth, and all that is a single field, a flat surface with ripples, radius, a bunch of interfering patterns and radiuses from points.
As a deformation lattice offset, or as a...
Yeah, it was in Houdini, it was a set of sine waves, essentially just a set of sine waves added up to make look about right. Not Tessendorf's equations or anything, but it's a small pool of water, so I think it was relatively believable. But that little solver and that set of plugins that I wrote for Houdini was the foundation of the water we used in Castaway, which was, of course, an open water giant storm sequence with Tom Hanks in that raft.
Would you say that Monster House was another one of those films that caused a really big sort of step up in technology and tools?
That was a fun one because we were basically a RenderMan house for years and years and years. And when I met Gil Keenan, the director of Monster House, we immediately hit it off in our first like half an hour. And he asked me, like, what are some of your favorite movies? And I said, oh, I love stop motion and I love The Nightmare Before Christmas. And I've always wanted to do like a stop motion looking movie in CG, like, you know, something that feels like it was in a dollhouse. And I was just spouting off, like, maybe I wasn't gonna get the job, I don't know. But he immediately fell in love with that idea and he said, oh my God, that's exactly what I want to do too. And so we really hit it off creatively. So I thought, how are we going to achieve this look? And it's not to slight Pixar at all, but it was really to look at, like, we need global illumination. We need radiosity. We need bounce light. We need a different level of control. And I want to think like a photographer on this. Because that was really going to be my task. Oddly, as a visual effects supervisor on an animated movie, what does your job become? Suddenly I'm working on a motion capture set and helping Gil block scenes, but I'm also directing lighting as a DP. So I didn't see the leap from RenderMan and how we could get into a totally different, tangible, handmade look. That was the goal. So Marcos Fajardo I had known through a couple of other people, and he was the author of Arnold, the renderer. And I'd been following him off and on and seeing little tests here and there online, and it's, you know, about connections, about people who you know sometimes. And so I had an opportunity to meet him at SIGGRAPH. I can't remember the year, maybe it was 2004. And he had his laptop and he was showing me some demo renders he was doing on his laptop with gigantic amounts of geometry, and I was really kind of blown away. Simplified cases, right? But I came back to ImageWorks and I thought, I talked to a few people, Lawrence Trewick and a few key people here, about what would it take to bring in a new renderer to this facility.
But I mean, we're sitting here today with things like Spider-Man and Men in Black 3, which are using Arnold and completely achieving levels of realism that we'd almost never dreamt of because of that decision to kind of go out on that limb. And of course, even though Arnold now is separately available, you have your own strand of it inside. And there are other films. I just want to get back to one other, because one of my all-time favorite films is Surf's Up. I really think it was really terrific. And it seemed to me that that was the first time I remember that we freed up an animation camera and had a, what we, I guess today, kind of expect is a valid option if someone wants to go that way. But back then it was really groundbreaking to make it feel that documentarian in style, given it was so stylized in character.
That's right. It was so fun to make an animated documentary. And we brought in a documentarian who does surfing docs, and he, J.P. Beagley, who shot Step Into Liquid, was a producer on there. And he gave us a kind of a walkthrough on what it takes to make these shows. And it was just so obvious. I was sitting next to the directors, Chris Buck and Ash Brandon, when JP is talking to how they make these movies. And I'm like, we need a real camera. Because we were talking about different ways to simulate it. Like, could we do it with a with you know, something on a stick with a couple encoders and everything, and we're like, no, we need something on someone's shoulder that weighs about the same amount, because we need that serendipity you get from a live-action documentary. And there was some concern that it was another kind of risky move, because like, are you going to shoot the whole movie on one camera in a room, you know, a little bit bigger than this, with markers on the ceiling? Like, is that going to be the bottleneck that keeps the movie from getting in the theaters? Are we going to change too much when we get out on a set, a virtual set, and can look around? But everyone was trusting, and we decided to make the investment, and it was really interesting. So we had this marker set in the ceiling, we had this really highly accurate camera tracker, and we went to shoot our very first shot, which was the shot in the movie where Big Z's broken surfboard cracks into pieces and washes up on the shore. And we had storyboarded it. We knew what it was supposed to look like. You know, there's a certain angle on the board, and then come up and then look out on the horizon for where Z was, and he's gone. We tried it like 5, 10, 20 times in our little mocap setup, looking into the virtual camera, and the shot just looked terrible. And then James Williams, our head of layout, goes, you know, let me just try one like I was really standing on the beach. And just, this is what I would do if I was standing on the beach. I'm like, oh, that seems like a good idea. So instead of sticking to the storyboard, he just moved over, like the waves are coming this way. He just moved over, and he's like, I think I'd probably be standing here. And then he rolls it. He's got the button, hits roll. Everybody's standing back. He shoots the shot, looks up, zooms in, looks for Big Z. The shot was 100 times simpler. It was 10 times better, and everyone went. And it didn't take any time at all. Like, it was an extra 30 seconds to get the shot that worked in the movie, and everyone went, we never would have found this shot if we were, you know, zooming around in Maya with a camera and a mouse. Yeah. We never would have found that shot. We never would have stumbled across this, and we knew like that was going to work.
And of course, Sony would go on to do massive motion capture initiatives.
Yes, yeah. The work, you know, when we started doing the first big mocap movie, Polar Express with Bob Zemeckis, it was also a crazy time. Like, none of us knew what that movie was going to be, and you know, when we sat down with Bob Z to figure out what he wanted to do, you know, we're like, well, we should really try this 4 different ways. And so we set up this test. You know, we did a blue screen shoot, and we thought, we'll start with definitely preserving the actors, and we'll put in a CG environment and see what that feels like. Maybe we'll use less than the full actor. We'll shoot the whole actor, but maybe we'll put a CG character over him in CG costume, and maybe we'll just use like this part of his face. You know, we'll try some different experiments. We tried all these different flavors of how to make the movie that he wanted to make, which was a stylized. It wasn't a movie he could shoot live action, because
otherwise
at the time,
he'd shoot it live action.
Exactly. I mean, and he knew how to shoot movies live action.
The guy had a pretty good track record.
So this was. He wanted a movie that felt like it was inspired by Chris Van Allsburg's paintings in that book. And how could we make this painting come to life? So we tried lots of different methods. And after all of these different tests, the one that Bob fell in love with was, hey, I'm going to shoot it like like I'm shooting it in the round. I'm shooting it on a stage, and we'll figure out the cameras later. You know, let me just work with the actors. I love this, and then that'll be my blocking pass. And then we're going to go in and shoot it. And of course make changes and edits and things like that at that time. So a whole new way of making a film, for sure. I mean, not the first person to do a motion capture movie, but taking his live action background, applying it to a filmmaking process that made him comfortable. So I think by the end of Polar Express, we had, in a small capture area, not much bigger than this area right here, we could do bodies and faces for a couple, 3 people at the same time. But by the end of Beowulf, we were doing a whole sound stage of bodies and faces with...
You could have a horse ride through by that
We'd have horses, we'd have 40 actors at the same time, all with body and face marked up at the same time. And you know, the difference between being able to capture that in one pass versus capturing that in multiple passes and having to stitch all that together was, you know, night and day for the filmmakers.
Well, for me, motion capture never really made it. And it's just how I feel about motion capture.
Really?
I don't think it's a successful, the way it was being used on like Polar Express and especially Beowulf was the way to go. So Polar Express, I wish the film had been more stylized, which is sort of was the original intent. It kind of
was meant to look like a sort of picture book, right?
Well, yeah, but it kind of drifted from that. You know, it was more real than I think most of us wanted, but that's where the design was being taken. I thought we learned an awful lot from well, that film especially. I mean, we created a lot of things to do the motion capture there. Monster House happened. Beowulf was, you know, pushing it as far as we could push anything to get any of those figures to work right. So,
but Monster House was more stylized.
that was a good thing. I think that's when it works its best.
Right.
Or work as something that's not trying to be the star of a movie.
Right.
Especially a human. It's a tough thing to pull off. And when you have a movie that's full of them, and backgrounds and everything, the amount of pressure and the workload was extraordinary. And really, if I've got Anthony Hopkins, why don't I just shoot Anthony Hopkins? Why try to duplicate him? I don't know.
I think the constraints just come from time and money. I mean, it's a great opportunity to have, you know, to have a big budget on a movie, to be able to pull off those one-off shots or something that's really important to the director, or a moment that the only way you could achieve it would be through visual effects. You know, those don't come along very often. So the challenge of all the diversity on the movie was certainly, you know, difficult, because it didn't allow us to necessarily be economical about it as far as efficiency and saying, oh, we're going to build this one character and we're going to be able to use him in 400 shots. We have one character where we see him once.
The ship's
at the
attacking
end.
New York in the present day.
Right.
Incredibly detailed, wonderful shot design. I'm thinking, well, we must come back and spend the last part of the movie with those. You're going to see them again because, of course, the timeline didn't require it.
Right. There's a lot of detailed work in a lot of places in the movie,
and yet
sure.
They were A-grade shots, it felt like. I just felt like I'm so used to ABC shots.
Yeah.
And you seem to have lost all the C, or maybe lost all the Bs. And
well, you know what's funny? To me, and Ken might say the same thing, is that some of our hardest shots were just simple blue screens, right? It's not like, I have more confidence in being able to build a fully digital New York than getting a great, perfectly outdoor-looking lit blue screen that then I can throw a background behind and have it feel like it's going to be great.
Wow.
That's actually more of a challenge now to me, being on set and saying, working with the DP and saying, let's get this looking like it's outside because I know I have to put it outside later. That's actually a bigger worry or concern to me now than building a fully digital city, believe it or not.
So for me, one of the most spectacular uses of technology, if I can say that, for really good storytelling was Alice, which just seemed to be breathtakingly dramatic on screen, but it had to have got there through some hardcore tech, because obviously her head isn't that big as the Queen. I can tell that, and yet, and I think that was I don't know, could you comment on that? Because it seems to me like that was a really good point of, yes, there was a huge focus on technology, but it was to pull off these shots that now are iconic.
I would say by the time Alice got here, and especially at the end of Alice, for me, as on a personal level, I thought that was my best work I've ever done, and one of the best experiences I've ever had on a show. But I also feel for ImageWorks, they reached a level of expertise and artistry that I've never experienced anywhere else. And I just thought it was a beautiful thing they pulled off, as hard and all the blood that was being spilled during that time. But creatively, I think for everybody, it was a wonderful thing. And I just think all the technologies that have been building through all these years here and prior, you know, all over the place, and people learning it, becoming, you know, really adept at using all this stuff and working well with each other, because it's all about teamwork, really, I think, coalesced into that film for me, more than anything else. And I think I'm sort of drawn to movies, if I can, that have a lot of variety in them, just for my own sake. Gives me a lot of different things to think about.
Were there some moments where you felt like the facility upped a level in terms of the tools that the artists had available to them? Was there any instance where you went, okay, well now we've sort of solved that problem, that's great, because now I have that in the toolbox and we can move forward with it?
You know, I'm not going to pick one thing. To me, it's every department is constantly growing, and it's all important to me that the better everybody is, because I use everything in these shows most of the time. That you know, it helps me be more confident on what I'm going to design for a show. So there are, I guess, certain areas. I think in the building of the character models here kept improving to really an extraordinary degree where they're at now. I mean, I would do anything with those characters the way they're created here. Digital backgrounds, digital worlds and props and things are all great here now. I feel very confident about how I would design a shot instead of trying to use a real thing shot on a blue screen or whatever it would be.
A time that jumps out of my mind is on Alice in Wonderland, when you look at that caterpillar and the smoke in the air. I'm looking at the smoke, and it's incredibly detailed, and it's moving really, really slowly.
Oh, there's time to look at it.
And it's just hanging in the air. And You know, I'm thinking about the way the solvers work and the smoke usually dissipates and the level of detail and the size of that volume, because it was full screen. I'm like, this looks impossible. How do we do it? And I think it was last year at SIGGRAPH we documented the way we used a gas flip solver, and we solved the equation for how the fluids all move at a lower resolution, and then we basically advec through or track along with it a really high resolution dense grid with all that fine detail and make sure we preserve all those details. And it can hold up for hundreds and hundreds of frames, and it's really stable. And like talking to the guys who did that, I'm blown away that it's even possible, even today, and this was a few years ago. Well, I think something that was an important building block of the whole system and actually led to the evolution of Katana was the realization in the era of Spider-Man 1 and Polar Express that there was no way the complexity of our movies were going to fit inside the computers of the day. So we needed to build the system to assemble the stuff just in time for the renderer, which is a system we called assembly component. We still call it assembly component. And everyone now has a notion of something along these lines, where you build lots of different pieces and then you assemble them by offsetting them and putting them in space and maybe varying their materials just in time for the renderer, so that you don't have to build them if you're not looking that direction. But that was when we realized how much of New York we were going to need to have on screen in Spider-Man, and how many different sets and assets and props and everything we were going to have on Polar Express. The notion of being able to assemble stuff just in time for the renderer was really kind of a key foundational building block for our workflow. And then that led to the development really of Katana, because our previous systems didn't expect to get the data in this procedural, built just in time sort of way.
Right.
So we needed a system that knew how to speak that language, and where you could dive in and treat an assembly just like you could treat a character or anything else that you're getting from the upstream department. So it was an interesting shift, and the guys who really invented that, I don't think any of us knew at the time how significant that was going to be in terms of changing our workflow.
It allowed an escalation of image density, and that gave it a visual richness that I think really added tremendous production value.
It used to be that you could only defer load things like hair, because that was the only thing that was so complicated there was no way to generate a real model for it, right? And so you just generate
everything
your hair.
but the hair.
Exactly, you had everything else but the hair. And then all of a sudden, in just a couple of years, we went from everything being in the scene to everything being built just on demand, just in time for the renderer. And making, the first couple of years were pretty painful, but once we got through that adoption curve, making it convenient for the artist. So the fact that it was loaded just in time for the renderer wasn't a burden for them. It was just as convenient as if it was in camera.
I touched on the renderer there and said I was really glad you did develop it, because Sony's role in the development of Arnold is so significant, and really allowed this current era of physically based lighting and shading that we're sort of now in the midst of. And I think that level of realism is something that's really, even if it's not specifically in an animated film, a realistic photoreal shot, that level of lighting control I think has also been a just terrific benefit, because it seems to me today lighters are less people that are tricking and cheating and more people that are creatively lighting. Would you agree?
Absolutely. That's the whole design of Arnold and what we spent the majority of our time getting to. And of course we can still make stylized movies with real light, right? Just like you can make stylized stop motion movie and it looks completely different than a live action movie, but you're still shooting with the same rules of physics. And that's really the analogy we use when we talk to an art director on an animated film who might want to push the world in a certain way. We figure out how we're going to trick the audience and how we're going to art direct in this world, but we do it with lights that have the same controls that lights have on set, and we do it with materials that react in a very similar way of real life materials. And of course there's all sorts of fun tricks we can play because we're in the computer, but we've intentionally limited the number of controls that we have, that we expose the artists to, that break real life in a crazy way. And that's just so, it gives us a ton of advantages, but the biggest one is the artists get to be lighters instead of technicians who know, how to try to dial a Phong highlight to make it look something like a highlight looks like in real life.
The team here is what makes it. And so the development that happens on every movie, we kind of have to come back, like whatever Spider-Man did, whatever Men in Black 3 did, whatever Oz is doing right now, we have, at the end of the shows, we have to kind of come back and say, okay, how can the whole facility benefit from that? right? Because things happen on every show demands something
Yeah.
specific. And it's really about putting it back into the pot and saying, how can we steal from each other as a unit? And that's hard to do, but I feel like we've done a pretty good job of that here at ImageWorks.
So as Sony celebrates its anniversary, it's still fun coming to work here?
You know, for me, it's project driven. It is fun. I mean, I like working with such a creative group of people. I get a real high, even now, after all these years, of the kind of energy in a room where everyone's got ideas and trying stuff. And I don't micromanage people. I want to see what they can do. And so you get great surprises in dailies or see something fantastic if you give people the freedom to do stuff and still get the vision of the director out there too and whatever I want to get in on it. But it's a unique experience because there's so many people involved and it's so hard that you just try to keep that energy flowing. The creative energy to me is vital to still wanting to do this.